Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into Chapter 7 of The Psychology of Money. And let me tell you, this one completely flips the scripts on how most of us think about our finances. We're going to discover that the ultimate goal of having money isn't actually about buying more stuff, it's about buying freedom. There's this incredibly powerful quote right at the start of the chapter that perfectly paints a picture of what true wealth actually looks like. It says, "The highest form of wealth is the ability to wake up every morning and say, I can do whatever I want today." Just think about that for a second. True wealth isn't a fancy sports car parked in your driveway. It's having total autonomy over your life. Here's our roadmap for today's Explainer. We're going to cover the highest form of wealth, the psychology of control, wealth versus happiness, how work has changed, lessons from the elderly, and we'll wrap it all up with a final chapter recap. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the highest form of wealth. So, to really get a handle on what makes us happy, we've got to look at the data. Back in 1981, a psychologist named Angus Campbell published a massive study on well-being in America. Now, at that time, most psychology was strictly focused on things like depression or anxiety. But Campbell, he wanted to know what actually made people happy. And what he found was honestly pretty surprising. He realized you just couldn't easily group happy people by their income, where they lived, or their education level. Basically, money, just on its own, wasn't the magic answer we all kind of hope it is. But here's the crucial part. Campbell did find a common denominator among the happy folks. It wasn't a huge salary, and it wasn't a massive house. It was having a strong sense of control over their own lives. Literally, just being able to dictate what you do, when you do it, and who you do it with. That turned out to be the absolute most dependable predictor of positive well-being. It is essentially the universal fuel of joy. So just to sum up this first point for you, true wealth isn't a specific dollar amount sitting in a bank account. It's that feeling of total control. Moving right along to Section 2, the psychology of control. So you're probably wondering, how do we actually build that control? Well, it's not just an all-or-nothing thing. Unspent assets actually build your independence step by step. It's like a ladder. Just having enough savings to take a few sick days without totally panicking about your bills, that right there is a huge level of control. And then it scales up. Having enough cash on hand to wait for a good job if you happen to get laid off, rather than just desperately taking the very first terrible offer you get. Or say you build a 6-month emergency fund. Suddenly, you stop being terrified of your boss. Further up that ladder, having savings buys you the flexibility to take a lower-paying job that maybe has a much better commute or flexible hours. And finally, the ultimate control. Retiring exactly when you want to, not just when you have to. But let's flip the coin and look at the dark side of this equation. The author actually shares a personal story about landing this highly coveted summer internship as an investment banker. The pay? Absolutely incredible. The actual work? Super intellectually stimulating. But he says it was literally the most miserable month of his entire life. Why? Because he was forced to work incredibly long hours and had zero, and I mean zero, control over his own schedule. All that high pay completely failed to make up for the fact that he'd essentially become a slave to a boss's demands. There's actually a specific psychological term for why this feels so incredibly terrible. It's called reactance. Reactance is this phenomenon where people feel totally disempowered when they're forced to do something, so naturally they push back. This means that doing something you might actually love, but having to do it on a schedule you can't control, triggers this reactance. It makes an otherwise intellectually stimulating job feel exactly like doing a chore you absolutely hate. So, to recap this section real quick, money is most valuable when it's used to buy time, because lacking control will turn even the greatest jobs into pure misery. All right, let's jump into Section 3, wealth versus happiness. Okay, so we've established that control brings joy, right? So how are we actually doing with this as a modern society? Let's contrast that stressed out, highly paid banker with a guy named Derek Sivers. He's an entrepreneur who managed to achieve total life freedom at just 22 years old. How in the world did he do that? He didn't sell some $1 million tech startup, no way. He literally just saved up $12,000 and kept his living costs incredibly low. We're talking about $1,000 a month. Because his costs were so remarkably tiny, that small savings account made him completely free to quit his day job and just be a full-time musician. He bought his freedom early, not by making a massive income, but simply by minimizing his material desires. Now, compare Derek's strategy to what most of America is doing today. The United States is currently the richest nation in the history of the world. And yet, if we look closely, we really aren't noticeably happier than we were way back in the 1950s. We have so much more wealth today, for sure, but man, we have far more stress to go with it. The numbers here tell an absolutely incredible story. Look at this. Back in 1955, the median family income, and this is adjusted for inflation, was about $29,000. Fast forward to 2019, and that number had more than doubled to over 62,000. And think about our homes too. We jumped from living in a modest 983 square feet in the 50s to these massive 2,400 square foot houses today. Basically, we've used our massive wealth to buy significantly bigger stuff, which, ironically, just gives us plenty of room to store all the things we no longer have time to actually use. We literally gave up control over our own schedules just to pay for it all. And the results of this massive trade-off? It is staggering. In a 2019 Gallup poll, 45% of Americans reported feeling a lot of worry just the previous day. That is way, way higher than the global average of 39%. Think about that for a second. We are wealthier than ever, we're living in bigger houses than ever, and yet almost half the country is just constantly worried. So the takeaway here is pretty clear. As a society, we've traded our autonomy for square footage, and it has made us measurably more stressed out. Let's move on to Section 4, How Work Has Changed. So why exactly are we objectively so much richer, but subjectively so much more worried? Well, it's largely driven by a massive fundamental shift in how we actually do our jobs today. To understand modern work, it really helps to look at one of its early pioneers, John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller was actually famous for being remarkably quiet. He would spend most of his time just sitting in a chair, thinking. His workers honestly thought he did nothing all day. But his true product, his actual deliverable, wasn't physically moving heavy oil barrels with his hands. It was the strategy he was figuring out inside his head. See, back in the 19th and 20th centuries, most jobs were manual labor. You went to the factory, you used the factory's tools, and when the whistle blew and you clocked out, you detached completely. The work was highly visible and tangible. I mean, you couldn't exactly build a car in your living room, right? But today, in the 21st century, most of us are what we call knowledge workers, just like Rockefeller. Our primary tool is our brain. And the huge problem with your brain being your main tool is that the work never, ever truly leaves you. The writer Derek Thompson hit the nail on the head when describing the shift. He said, if the operating equipment of the 21st century is a portable device, this means the modern factory is not a place at all. It is the day itself. Because our smartphones and laptops allow us to be totally productive during our morning commute or sitting at the dinner table or even at 2 in the morning when we're staring at the ceiling, we constantly feel like we're on the clock. That perpetual 24/7 connection drains our sense of control, which completely fuels that exact anxiety we were just talking about. In short, knowledge work means we literally never clock out, and that is just eating away at our freedom.
Which brings us to Section 5, Lessons from the Elderly.
Okay, so if modern work is trapping our time and stressing us out, how do we fix our mindset? Well, let's turn to the experts, the people who have already lived through it all. A gerontologist named Karl Pillemer actually sat down and interviewed 1,000 elderly Americans. He was searching for the most important lessons they learned from decades of life experience. And honestly, what's most fascinating is what they did not say. Out of 1,000 people, literally zero, not one single person said you should work hard just to buy the things you want. Nobody said it was important to be as wealthy as the people around you. And absolutely no one said you should choose your career based on its earning power. It turns out, when you get to the end of your life, the relentless pursuit of maximum money completely loses its value. Instead, they universally valued completely different things. They valued having really quality friendships. They valued being part of something bigger than themselves. And most importantly, they valued spending quality, totally unstructured time with their children. As Pillemer noted, your kids don't want your money. They want you. They want your time. So the ultimate lesson from the elderly is crystal clear here. Relationships and time are just vastly more valuable than any kind of material status. And that brings us to Section 6, our final chapter recap. Let's do a quick rundown of the essential takeaways I really want you to grab from this explainer today. First up, money's highest dividend, its absolute best feature, is its ability to buy you control over your own time. Second, think of every single dollar of unspent savings as a stepping stone toward your total independence. Third, beware the trap of modern society. We are constantly trading our finite time for bigger stuff. And as we've seen, that really only leads to chronic anxiety and that terrible feeling of always being on the clock. And finally, take the advice of those who've been there. Prioritize your relationships and your daily freedom over highly visible material wealth. True wealth isn't the flashy stuff people can see. It's that peace of mind you feel when you go to sleep at night. I want to leave you with one final provocative thought today. If you had enough unspent assets to control 100% of your time tomorrow, what is the very first thing you would change about your day? Just take a second and really think about that. As you reflect on your own financial journey, keep your answer to that question front and center. Let that be your actual financial goal. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer today, and as always, keep learning.